Goes off. Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you to our discussions in First Corinthians. Last week we were discussing First Corinthians chapter 8. We finished up that chapter, and we are beginning in First Corinthians chapter 9 this week. We want to welcome you along with our other broadcasters at this time, Sonny Young, Paul Benton, and Michael Hatcher. We are hoping that if you are able to join us that you will, and if you are not able to join us immediately, that you will catch us on YouTube at Michael Hatcher 52. This week as we begin, let's look at the passages. We hope that we're able to cover at least 14 verses in chapter 9 today. We may not cover them all, but we'll give them a pretty good shot. Paul here, after his conversation with the brethren, culminating in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, they're, of course, speaking about things that were offered to idols, and, of course, this idea, again, of what can be eaten and what cannot be eaten, and how it may offend someone or not offend them, and who are the strong and who are the weak. And, of course, there, Paul, in explaining to them, there is one God, and these things are not nearly as important as some are trying to make them out to be. As concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I think he continues to make a little bit of that argument, but as he goes forward, he does change gears in the way that he presents it. Beginning with verse 1, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? If I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you, for the seal of my apostleship are ye in the Lord. Mine answer to them that do examine me is this: have we not power to eat and to drink? Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas? Or I only and Barnabas? Have not we power to forbear working? Who goeth a warfare any time at his own charges? Who planteth the vineyard and eateth not of the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth a flock and eateth not of the milk of the flock? Say I these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. Doth God take care for oxen? Or saith he it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he that ploweth should plow in hope, and that he that thresheth in hope should be partaker of this hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it not a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? For others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power, but suffer all things, lest we should hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple, and they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar? Even so, the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Now, these are in many ways controversial mainly in the way that some people view them today. I'd like to begin just with the opening subject that we're going to return to, which has more of a relevance for us today: the open hostility to gospel preachers. And I'd like to look at that, of course. First of all, I want to go through some of the things that Paul is talking about in these verses, and then we'll come back to that particular subject. I think that Paul here is opening up a wound that in many ways remains fresh today. Paul is certainly keen here to establish the credentials of his apostleship, but I don't think he's doing this because they are in doubt. I think that what he's doing is that in many ways he has freely chosen to renounce the rights which some of the Corinthians regarded as part of the status of an apostle. I think that when you go back to the second chapter, when he verses 1 through 5, and he tells them that he's not eloquent of speech, and here, of course, where he's talking about financial support, and perhaps in Corinth there is a perception there is something deficient, perhaps, about his status because he has not used the authority that he certainly would have. I think he is defending his apostleship only really in order to establish the rights that he chooses to renounce. And this argument here casts doubt on some of the people who are taking advantage of the Corinthians in their midst. I think that when we look at the issues that are raised here, we see a number of rhetorical questions that probably not even in dispute in Corinth, but Paul, he's really not asking this in order to get a negative response, but rather, when we look at the wording of the questions, it indicates that he expects the Corinthians to respond to the questions in the affirmative. And he expects the questions to be sufficient in themselves to establish his freedom on the basis of his apostolic status. When he talks about rights, and that word, the exalgia, which of course means right and power and authority. And when we look at these questions that he presents in verses 4 through 6, they deal with a number of aspects of support, food and drink, and marital companionship, and working for a living respectfully. These are some of the things here that when we begin to look at these, we begin to see the kind of issue that Paul is presenting to the Corinthians. And I think we also see the kinds of things that in the church today really do sometimes present problems. But let me go back to the original question here, because I think in some ways Paul is addressing this for us. But what is it that causes people to have such hostility toward gospel preachers? And I'll begin with, if I might, I'll begin with Paul, not being a person who is normally preaching. But what is it about preachers, Paul, that people seem to have such hostility toward them? Why is that?
I suppose in most cases is where if you've preached on a certain subject and it happens to be something that relates to what they're doing and they know it's wrong, usually that's the point at which you'll have an adverse reaction, if you like. If that's
but isn't the point of preaching to, along with in the exhortation, certainly to bring a message that could be very vital to that specific congregation and to specific individuals in the congregation? I mean, couldn't it be that a preacher is preaching on, you say, a sensitive subject? Couldn't it be that that subject is of necessity being presented because one's salvation could be in jeopardy? Should they not change their lives and repent? We always preach to uplift, and even in correction there should be uplift. Despise not thou the chastening of the Lord.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that is what we do when we try to preach the word. And in some instances, you may know of a certain individual that is crossing the line, so to speak. So you will preach on that subject, hoping to touch them and hoping that they will repent or turn away from whatever it is they're going to do to cause them to sin. But yes, you would hope that they would repent or think about what they're doing so that they don't fall into sin in the first place. but often they tend to take it personally and go on the attack, go on the defensive, rather than heed the word.
And Michael, doesn't the congregation own the preacher anyway? Don't they have the right to determine everything in his life, hold over him all matters financial, keep him under their thumb? Isn't he an hireling? Isn't he, at least the impression among many, isn't he just a hireling?
That's the impression that a lot of people have. Whether they would ever admit that is a different matter, but that is what takes place. They look at the preacher as an outsider. He's not one of us. He's just here. We have hired him to do our work for us.
Well, why is he an outsider?
Because as to why, I don't know. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that, but it's just the way in which people feel about him. He didn't grow up here. He doesn't really live here. He's been hired to come here, and you know, when we get through, we'll hire someone else, and he'll move on. So he's not really a part of us, and that's the way in which a lot of preachers feel in relationship to the congregation they're at.
But let me just enter in here a second. I want to go back to actually we're going to use this next year for the English lectures. I want to go over to the passages though that are found in 2 Timothy chapter 2. I believe it's chapter 2, and let's see. Yes, chapter 2 and verse 2. The things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Wouldn't a congregation think that they have somewhat of a responsibility to grow their own preachers and teachers and leaders? I mean, I know that it's not always going to be a case that a preacher is going to grow up in a congregation, but for instance, you were born in Pensacola, you grew up in Pensacola, you live in Pensacola. You don't? Okay, well, I'll get some of that wrong. But
I was born in Pensacola, but I was raised in Texas.
You were raised in Texas. Well, see,
we left Pensacola before I was 2 years old.
There are always the downsides of life, but but you came back to Pensacola, so your experience might be somewhat different. Is that correct?
I think it's congregation to a great extent. Not so much the preacher or where he's from, it's the attitude of the congregation. The congregation through the years has hired someone to come in to preach. I think preachers are partly to blame through the years because there's a lot of preachers who they had 2 years of sermons or 4 years of sermons. They would preach those sermons and then be moving someplace. So they never really did stay and become a part of the congregation.
So some of the fault would lie therein with preachers themselves.
I think it's both sides from that standpoint. And the congregation looking at the preachers, we've hired you to come and preach for us. Well, you're not a part of us that way. You're not. You didn't grow up here, as you said. You're not going to stay. You're here for a short period of time, and then we'll find someone else to replace you when you move on. And the preachers were happy with that type of an arrangement to a certain extent. I know of preachers who believe that a preacher should never stay over at a congregation over X number of years, whether it be 2 years or 5 years or whatever it might be. They just did not believe that a preacher should stay there.
Well, you said they did not believe. Did they have any sort of scriptural authority for that?
No, they would just their views in relationship to what was expedient.
Well, in order to be a part of a congregation, really, in order to be a part of a work, you have to immerse yourself into that congregation into which you have come. You have to immerse yourself into the community. Otherwise, you are just a hireling.
And that's what's taken place in the church to a great extent through the years. Is it changing? I don't know. But that grew that, as you called it, hostility between or with preachers, because they are just here for a short period and they're going to be moving on. They're an outsider. They're not really a part of us. If a person feels like, okay, you're only going to be here, let's say 2, 3, 4 years, and you're moving on, no matter how much you try to immerse yourself into that congregation, they're always going to feel like that, because they're going to have that feeling in the back of their mind, you're going to be leaving soon.
Is that what led to, and I actually don't know the history of this, perhaps you or Sonny or Paul may know more, is this what led to or also allowed the buildings to be in proximity to the home?
I think probably so. I can't say for certain. And also probably
this is not your home. This is our home.
For the church building a home for the preacher, because it became difficult and especially in smaller towns to buy and sell houses, so it became more of an expedient, at least for the congregation's sake.
I wondered if it had anything, any sort of connection, and I don't know the history of it.
I don't really know for certain.
But looking at how some of these Catholic dioceses work, where they have these accommodations that are the parishes, so to speak.
Yeah.
But anyway, you see this volatile situation that can occur when perhaps a preacher goes in. Maybe his mindset is, I'm only going to be here a few years. I really don't intend to stay very long, and then I'm going to be moving on. I was in a conversation with a young fellow who, at the time, was a new employee over at Apologetics Press. This was many years ago, and this person was saying, many of the preachers in the South, they because congregations are all over the place, they work someplace 2 or 3 years. If any trouble erupts, then they'll just get up and move on and not have to deal with it. I asked if he thought that they would ever learn how to deal with adversity if they keep moving on from place to place. If you never confront trouble, then you won't learn how to resolve many issues.
But what he said was accurate.
Mm-hmm.
Not talking about right or wrong. That was the situation.
And it was, and I think that my reaction to it was purely, at the time, this was pre-2005. This was probably around 2002 or somewhere in that line. My reaction to it was based on the experience in the Bay Area, where I think in many of the congregations, most of the congregations, the preachers have been there in almost every congregation, 15, 20, 25, up to 30 years and more. A completely different type of situation.
Completely different type of situation and arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, as he was saying, in the South in particular, you see that movement all of the time. And as I said, there were literally some preachers who would have 2 years of sermons. They would go to a congregation, preach those 2 years, and move.
Well, what's expected? Let's ask ourselves this question too. When we go a little bit deeper, a few minutes into what Paul is saying, verses 4 through 6. what is expected of a preacher? I've seen some ads, and they, in many instances, it seems that they want the preacher to do what the congregation should be doing, or what the leadership should be doing. And it's almost as if he is a hired gun. We want someone who's going to visit the sick. We want someone who's going to evangelize the community. We want someone who is going to make decisions about in some of these doctrinal issues. It's as if they expect that the preacher is going to take on the role of the sheriff or the gunslinger, in many instances, to do the work that the congregation should be doing itself. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. Let me tell you two situations, and these are personal experiences. I had someone at a congregation I was preaching at, and I was going to be leaving, who came to me, wanted to meet, so we met, and they had two things to tell me. The one that concerns this was that they needed someone there who would run the church.
Did they have elders?
Yeah, they had two elders, but they needed a preacher there who would run the church. And I didn't do that, so they needed someone else. Now, that's one of the members of that congregation. In applying two different congregations through the years, one of them, and talking to them, they said, basically the idea, if you're out socializing and you don't have time to prepare a sermon, then that's really all right with us. You need to be out socializing.
Wow.
Needless to say, we didn't talk but that one time, and that was the end of it. But that shows some of the attitudes that brethren have.
Let me get over to the other side of the pond, so to speak. Sonny, is this sound new to you, or is this something very similar to what you face over in the UK?
I have been involved in the teaching and preaching program in the church for the last 21 years. 7 years I spent in the congregation and sat in the men's meeting, and that was in Wembley. I remember those days where the the worship committee had to decide on the salary package of the preacher, the minister, basically the two ministers then. And I remember there was a year that they wanted to draft an employment contract for the ministers. So I was involved in that, and then some of the men from the committee said to me that, well, we would like the ministers to we like to have the contract to include a 40-hour a week working hours for the ministers. So I said that how do you determine 40 hours per week minimum? So if it's 9 to 5, what if they have to visit someone? Let's say you get a call from the evening, a couple having a dispute, and so they have been called to assist. So do we pay them overtime? Does Sunday preaching and teaching count as working hours? So I say that we need to understand that basically that these brethren who are serving as ministers and preachers and teachers in the church, they are serving us. They're helping us. We are not the employers, and hence we should not dictate the number of hours that they do. And I think that there was a sense. I remember there was a sense of the church being the employer of the ministers. We are the boss, so we should be telling them what to do and how to do it. And I disagree with that. Basically, I say that they are serving us, and we're not giving them a salary. We are supporting them while they serve us this spiritual food through their teaching and preaching, the time they spend on thinking and studying the Bible.
So
know,
it's a
I think
it's a mode of thinking or a lack of understanding the underlying biblical principles that we find Paul discussing in 1 Corinthians 9.
That's right. Yes, yes. I think that sort of you know, that we are the providers of your rice bowl, so as to call it, so that you know, that you jolly well do what we tell you to do, and hence it caused problems basically. That I think that the preachers were afraid of upsetting the brethren, you know, for fear of their own rice bowl, which is understandable. So that's why I'm glad that since I left the congregation, you know, when I got involved in the preaching and teaching program in the churches, the two congregations that I wasn't a paid minister, so I have no worries about my rice bowl because I earn my own rice bowl. So I would say anything I want. I mean, that if they upset, then that's tough. Too bad. You can't sack me. In that sense, I thought that was good. I think it's in the sense that yes, it's true that you know, that idea of these preachers are our employees. They are not one of us, as Lord Michael said, that all they know is only just to read the Bibles and study the Bibles, and they do not know the real world. And that's why I think that sometimes members found it very difficult to accept a preacher, especially a full-time preacher, you know, his exhortation: stay faithful. When you're tested in your faith, hang on to God. You know, and I remember hearing from brethren many years back, where the minister said that in a sermon, and I think someone said to me that, what does he know about trials? He doesn't have to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning to go to work and work overtime. You know, in a sense that the evangelist or the preacher lives in a very protected environment. He just stays at home and does what he needs to do, and we pay him to do that. He's not like us. We have to face the real world, and hence he is not one of us in a sense. He doesn't understand. He doesn't understand us because he's not out there to fight for his rice bowl. Whether he wakes up at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, we still pay him. You know, I think it's very sad that some brethren sees the preachers as such, without realizing that there is more to it than just simply just doing the job itself.
Let's look at what Paul himself says here, and I think it's indicative of what we have been mentioning here. When we look at verses 4 through 6 in 1 Corinthians, I think it sort of gives us an idea of not only what it is that was really getting on the Corinthians' nerves in terms of use that phrase in a pejorative way for them. He says, well, I'll start from the beginning. Obviously, he points these things out, these rhetorical questions that there's no argument about. But then verse 3, he says, to those who would examine me in this, who question my right to do this. And I think that in a number of ways, this idea of rights really goes back to the previous chapters in some ways. But when he talks about, have we not the power, the right to eat and drink, literally, the idea there, of course, well, I think going back to part of the argument that the Corinthians had about their right to eat whatever they want to eat, but here Paul is discussing his right to certain support. Do I not have a right here that I have chosen really not to exploit? But when he looks at this, do I have not have the power to eat and drink? Do I not have the power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as the others have, as the brethren of the Lord, as even Cephas or Peter has? Or is it a personal thing? Is it really something that only applies to Barnabas and myself, that we do not have the power to not work? And I think in those areas, I think these are really sensitive areas. Paul mentioned certain sensitivity to these things. I think these things become quite sensitive to the brethren. When you talk about money. It really lays out what a responsibility is in terms of the preacher. Now, there are circumstances, varying circumstances, where a preacher may be in a congregation. I know of a brother who goes out and preaches for a little small congregation, 8 or 9 people, and he has a secular job as well. But realistically, he knows that they would not be able to support him and his wife, his family, full time. That just, from a monetary standpoint, would not be feasible. But there are instances where you have congregations that are large in size, and they don't want to pay the preacher anything. They don't, and it becomes fractious. It becomes quite an open animosity event when you have the preacher and some of the members. Good elders wouldn't do this, but you have members, they really want the preacher to come crawling to them on his hands and knees, begging them for 25 cent an hour increase. I mean, essentially that's what their view is. We want you to come crawling to us, begging us for any increase, and we'll throw you a crumb. We'll toss something out to you, as they did Lazarus. That's the view.
There's an aspect on that, though, that there are some brethren who had the feeling that preachers, it was expected of them to sacrifice, and that meant sacrifice financially as well. That preacher could not have anything nice. Yet, of course, they were supposed to wear nice clothes and drive a nice car, but not of course, Cadillac. But
not too nice of a car.
Yeah, not too nice, but
not too nice of a suit either.
No, true. But they were expected to sacrifice.
Well, that's a denominational view. I don't want to say it's entirely a Catholic view. It's certainly not a view that some denominations hold, because, well, let's just go on. Go ahead. What were you going with?
And so, but that was the attitude of a lot of our brethren through the years. And
well, how does that square with what Paul was just saying there?
It doesn't. But
and he wouldn't dare preach on that, would he?
Well, a preacher nowadays better not. But of course, anytime you mention money, you're wanting a raise. That was the thinking as well.
Is that a sin? I just want to make sure.
Well, it would have to be, I guess, at least in their thinking. But that, let's face it, that was the thinking of a lot of brethren through the years. I think we're getting out of that type of a thinking more and more, but it's still there as far as some brethren are concerned.
I would agree with Michael. I remember many years back that the paid minister in the congregation preached on collection and giving. And someone commented that I think that he's worried about his rice bowl. That's quite true. Yes, quite true.
Well, and a point to that, Sonny, is that the preacher really should not have to worry about his rice bowl. If he is doing the work that he is expected by God to do, if he is doing the work that the congregation has asked him, well, we're going to put this on a higher plane and say that all the engines are running on the right schedule. He's doing what he should do, and the congregation is appreciating him as they should, the work that he does, the time that he puts in, the effort that goes into crafting a sermon, the visitation, everything that's just a part of his life. He should not have to worry about those things. His life, use that term without being a pejorative, his livelihood should not be in jeopardy. If he's what more noble employment could one have than in the preaching and teaching of the gospel with the hope that other souls might be saved? what is a more noble endeavor than that? And when brethren come to understand that and appreciate that in the way that one should as a Christian, your support will be reflective of that understanding. And
let me ask you a question along that line, though. Has the televangelist of our day affected people's thinking along that line?
Well, I think televangelists have helped to give a demeaning view of gospel preachers. Many people see them as money-hungry ogres.
That's what I mean. That attitude.
Elmer Gantries, and I think that they see them as frauds. Basically, I think they see them as frauds, and that does perhaps carry over in some way of thinking for people for the pulpit evangelists. I think that they see them and wonder, are they in it for the money? And of course, a lot of, I can't say that no one is not in it for the money. There are probably some brethren, I hate to think of it as any brethren, but I'm sure that there are people in religion who are in it just for the money. You can't be a gospel preacher, not a New Testament preacher, who you're trying to wholly commit yourself to what you're doing, and have yourself really thinking about money. You're going to have sustenance, of course. But those things, God will take care of many of those things for you. But you're going to have to take care, in some instances, you have to take care of some of those things yourself. And sometimes brethren will perhaps, or should perhaps, step up and remind the brethren of some of those things. I mean, when we look back at what Paul is mentioning here, he's talking about providing for. He's talking about them providing for him food and providing for him the ability to, as he says here, to for material support for he and his wife. So you're talking about family there. You're talking about support for those things, and I think that sometimes congregations, they figure, well, we'll just give him the minimum wage, and he should be able to live off that. And if he can't live off that, then we'll find someone else. He certainly better get another job. He probably better get two. And we'll whatever. Let's they say Paul was a tent maker. So let the preacher go out and get a couple jobs, and whatever is lacking, we'll make up the rest.
And if he buys something they think is too expensive, then we're paying him too much.
Yes, you have all of those attitudes out there. When you look at what Paul is striking at, is completely the opposite of that mindset, and he speaks to that quite eloquently. As a matter of fact, he goes on from those verses. Who goeth to warfare any time in his own charge? We wouldn't send soldiers. I mean, how many soldiers would we be able to support? If we, or how many soldiers will we have if we depended on them buying all their own gear, all their own artillery, buying their own vests, what will we expect? So he just appeals to a certain, even secular knowledge there. We don't. Who planteth the vineyard eateth not of its fruit. All of these things, as he goes back, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treadeth out the corn. He provides them with scriptural evidences of this concept going back into the Old Testament, and even even the Lord Himself spoke to this, and it's not something that's really a question. It's not even a question. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. And I think when you have brethren who feel differently about this issue, you really probably have on your hands a heart issue there, more than anything else. There's an aversion to preachers. Some of it may have been born of past experiences. It's very difficult to know in every instance what it is that has led to certain attitudes. But I think that Paul is presenting us here with what God's view of this is. And that's the important thing. Are we understanding what God's view is? Now, a congregation may not be able to fully support someone. Maybe they don't have the numbers to do that. But their mindset should be that if we could, we would. Their mindset should be, what can we do for this man who is serving us? And first of all, serving the Lord, and viewing it that way. And I think that's the kind of thing that we see Paul is addressing here. Though I think there's also a little bit of an underlying discussion that he's making. But it does show that in the world today, this issue is not a new one. It's one where we see, and some people, I'd heard some people say, well, he's only talking about the apostles. It's obvious that he's not just talking about apostles there. Not only by naming Barnabas, but he says, and as the others. But there is that view, there is that hostility, and we would hope that others would recognize what the Bible teaches on it and have a change of mind. We want to thank you for being with us this afternoon, this evening. Any other thoughts from the panel? Then I guess we'll call it an afternoon. We're so glad to have you here with us. We hope that the things that we've said have been able to enlighten you on some of these issues. We bid you good afternoon. Join us next week.